Welcome to Safe, Efficient, Profitable, a worker safety podcast where we break down real problems from real situations and discuss realistic solutions. And here is your host, owner of Allen Safety LLC, Jen Allen.
Welcome to Safe, Efficient, Profitable. We're going to do something a little bit different today. I'm kind of excited about it. If you're with us on YouTube, you can see my awesome smartboard here. If you are not and you're listening in the car, I'm going to try and do my very best to kind of explain everything and walk you through this. But just know that there is a visual. If you want to go check that out, by all means, go ahead and do that. But today we're going to be talking about emergency action plans, EAPs, whatever you call it. And when I'm referring to that, I'm not talking about the refrigeration, IIAR, chemical stuff. I'm talking about whatever you call your plan that is designed to handle all of the different variety of emergencies that you could potentially have at your location. So let's just kind of dive right in here. The first thing that we're going to kind of want to work through when we're figuring out our EAP, whether we're restructuring, writing it from scratch, or updating, making modifications, doing our annual review, things like that, we want to figure out how is the best way to organize this document, because it can be a lot of pages. It can be difficult to write. This is one of those you got to be in the right frame of mind to do, right? So you've got to be ready to go, clear-headed. I find whenever I write EAPs, we write them all custom. I find that it's really, really helpful to not have a lot of interruptions. So this may be one of those you're doing early in the morning after everybody leaves, or on weekends or something like that, or you just close your door and say, I need an hour. I'm going to work on this an hour every day. But I find that this is one of those that it's a little bit difficult to hop in and out of if you've got interruptions going on. So I would just encourage you to do this if you are writing it from scratch, or you're doing a review and making some major modifications, to try and do that when you're in the right frame of mind, the right headspace, because that makes a huge difference. And then also when you're going to have minimal interruptions. So the next thing is we're going to talk about in terms of structuring the document itself is we've got a couple of options. We can make it a little bit where it feels a little bit on the redundant side, but there is some value to that. It's just all in how it works out for you. Or you can have something structured where, it's like turn to page 47, for this portion of how to respond to the emergency. Now, when I'm talking about redundant, what I mean is for each individual emergency that you as a team have kind of determined, yeah, I could see that happening here. Whatever that looks like, you have from start of the implementation or initiation of your emergency protocols, getting an incident manager involved, a trained incident manager involved to start actively managing, coordinating, and kind of being the overall person that's managing the entire response to whatever your emergency is. Whenever you kind of put that in place and we're like, okay, we're under the EAP now, all the way through hiring contractors if worst case scenario requires it, and getting everything turned back over to normal operations, normal production. Depending on the severity of your event, this could be 45 minutes, it could be 15 minutes, it could be 3 weeks. Depending on if it's something like a hurricane flooded you out a little bit, it could be months. So that's where we kind of talk about if you're going to have a turn to page, whatever, and you're going to have it kind of reference different pages and have maybe something like your return to normal would be at the back, and you're going to reference that section throughout all of the different emergencies that you're listing within your program. You'll want to make sure that you are putting a little bit of detail in that, though, because there's going to be a pretty significant difference in my return to normal operations if I've got a medical event, a caught-in, an amputation, an arc flash event, something of that nature, as opposed to I had a tornado or an explosion. So we'll want to make sure that we are doing our best to make sure that, again, I'm a big proponent of it's got to be custom. The whole concept is we should be able to read it and know exactly what we're doing, exactly step by step how we're going to, as a company, choose to manage this situation. I don't want to try and wing it and hope for the best and be like, well, we'll figure it out when we're there. There are some things that I do truly believe in my heart we can kind of predict and think through, and just at least have some kind of ballpark plan and So that's one of the things that we'll want to try and figure out is how are we going to structure this? What's the best way? Hyperlinks, we want to make sure they work. We want to make sure we've got a table of contents in this for sure, especially if it's going to be a lengthier document or we're going to be flipping around the different pages a lot. So if it's accessed online, predominantly accessed online, we'll want to think that through that too. Where are we going to be setting up to run this emergency based on the different types of emergencies, and what kind of resources are we going to have available to us to be able to do that digitally? So that's also something worth just kind of working through and trying to predict, as well as what's going to work best for your location. And then we'll also want to have something somewhere, because this is predominantly how we're going to manage emergencies, but we do need to have something in there about just how we're going to manage this process overall. So how are we going to manage training the managers that we say this is your role? How do we notify the managers of their roles and responsibilities under this plan, and then train them on whatever that looks like? How do we make sure that they have the skills and the tools and the training and understanding to know how to successfully manage that? Just because someone is a manager level does not necessarily mean that they have the background and the skill sets and the training to manage some of the nuances and some of the specifics in regards to some of these different emergencies. So we want to make sure that we're giving them training on exactly what we expect them to do. And if there's a better way to do it and a safer way that keeps them safe and it helps protect any victims, make sure we don't have more victims, it protects the company, everyone's protected, whatever that methodology is, that's the one that we'll want to document down in here and then teach them on. The next piece we want to make sure that we're kind of working through is our drills. So are we going to drill? How often are we going to drill? Who's going to be involved in the drills? Are we drilling on all shifts? Are we drilling, just on a Saturday, everybody comes in? How are we going to manage, and what are going to be the requirements around this program and working through the different emergencies within it, and then coordinating any kind of drills based on the different versions of the emergencies and the responses expected. And then our maps. So how are we managing the emergency maps that we have posted on the wall? When are they getting updated? How often are we reviewing them? Are we making sure that my emergency lights and my egress signs and my egress paths and my primary and secondary evacuation routes, all of that makes sense, and they're updated and they're legible and I can read them, and they're posted in a high traffic area so that everyone knows where they are. They make sense for that department. How am I going to manage the maps? So that's something else that we'll want to make sure that we're kind of addressing in some capacity as well. Who should be involved in this? So typically speaking, this is going to be all my senior staff, right? So first off the bat, I'm going to have HR involved if I can. And the reason I'm going to have HR involved is because if I have any victims, I need to manage their dignity. I can't be providing medical treatment with everyone standing around in a circle and snapping photos. That's weird. So I need to make sure that I've got HR involved to a certain degree to make sure that when I'm providing treatment and we're doing some of these different things, or if there's something going on where I've got to, wash somebody down that got contaminated with chemical, whether it be outside, inside, fire department, however we're going to do that and give these folks care that may need care. We want to make sure that we're protecting their dignity and that we're not embarrassing them in one of their worst moments. So I'm going to have HR involved to help with that. I'm also going to have HR involved to kind of help me manage some of my shift communication. So if it's so bad that I can't bring in my next shift, or work is canceled, or it's going to be canceled for the next foreseeable several days, they're going to be the ones that help me work through that communication and getting that out to all the different employees that may not be on site during the event. My GM, typically speaking, if I don't have a corporate presence that's going to be doing some of my media communications, it's going to fall to my general manager on this. So their role is going to kind of be manage the media and just kind of help make sure that we've got resources in terms of whatever we need, to make sure that everything is going smoothly, that our LEPC responders, they're going to kind of help with act as a liaison for that as well. So they're going to be working with some of the government agencies and kind of just helping have a presence there, as well as the media. My safety and environmental. Now, this could be two different people. It could be two different staffs of groups. It could be one person, depending on the size of facility you have and just what all you are doing and what your particular specific operation is. The goal here, of course, is safety, environmental. Whoever is helping manage these is going to need to make sure that if we have any reportable quantity things going on in terms of releases of hazardous chemicals, we're making those phone calls. And also if we've got any runoff or things going on, on. If after an event we've got some contaminated product, then we need to make sure that it's safely disposed of, cradle to grave type stuff. That, RCRA, we're going to make sure that we follow all of the necessary environmental protocols, if I could talk today, to make sure that all of that is good to go and that we're not contaminating things and being a bad steward of the environment. The next piece is safety. They're going to kind of gap fill. They're typically speaking the owners of the EAP, Emergency Action Plan, the entire program. And their job is to just kind of gap fill who needs support, help provide support, make sure that each individual manager who's managing some of the different components of the response has what they need. And again, just kind of act as a liaison with any of the government agencies. They could act as a logger and take notes and write things down. But again, just kind of gap filling wherever they're needed, just kind of floating to just help make sure that we have a smooth response. Medical is going to be involved in the event that we have any victims or triage things happening. Maintenance, utilities folks, boiler engineering, refrigeration, whatever that group may be. They're going to typically be involved in anything going on with a critical shutdown. So critical shutdown of power, critical shutdown of chemical systems, refrigeration systems, anything with shutting down equipment, things like that. Whether it's power coming into the facility, controlled releases of things, we've had to do that sometimes based on whatever's going on. We've actually had to have controlled releases of refrigeration systems so that they weren't uncontrolled and released through an explosion, things like that. So that's typically going to be my maintenance and utilities teams. And then evacuation coordinators, production, folks like that. We have an evacuation going on and we have to leave the facility and we're going to a rally point. We are going to have an evacuation coordinators. Maybe it's my production supervisors that are kind of also doubling as this role. They're going to help make sure that we know are we going out the primary or the secondary evacuation route? What rally point are we going to based on what's happening? Are we evacuating upwind or does it not matter because it's not a chemical event or event where we're going to have contaminated air from smoke, from a fire, explosion, things like that. So they're going to help be working with your incident manager to best determine where should we set up, where should we stage, where can we be. And I will also point out real quick, when we evacuate, most locations want to evacuate to the fence line. And that is fine based on, the different versions of emergencies you could have. But I will caution you that we want to double check how close is the fence or the property line to the facility and where the emergency is actually taking place. And does that make sense? Or is that something that we maybe need to reevaluate based on different emergencies that could happen? So if I've got smoke pouring out and it's burning through and it's releasing hazardous chemicals, or I have a hazardous chemical leak, is my fence going to be far enough away? And you can also rely on your LAPC to help you with that. If you don't have a hazmat team, emergency response guidebook can give you some insight onto evacuation distances based on, what you should evacuate, what your distance should be first based on a small or large spill, and then how far downwind, day, night, things like that. And so that can be a good resource if you're looking at, we evacuate to the fence line. Is my fence line far enough away based on potential for explosion and shrapnel and things like that? So, and then we have sweeps. I am a huge proponent of never sending anybody back in the building unless they have been specifically trained to do some type of search and rescue situation. So under no circumstance would I ever suggest, if we have a fire explosion hazard, that anyone go back into the building. So just as an example, giving that one. If we do have a trained hazmat team and we find out when we're doing our counts at our rally point and, evaluating, is everyone here, is everyone accounted for, is everyone present? If we find that we have some folks that are not accounted for and it's a chemical situation or a bad air situation going on inside the facility, and I have a trained hazmat team that's been trained to go in and get victims. So that's kind of the caveat there, that if I've got a bad air situation and I have a team that's been trained to do the task, then that would be the group that would go back in and evaluate and try and find those unaccounted for persons. If I don't have those things, or that's beyond the scope of my team's training, that would be a fire department situation where they would identify if that's, something that they're even comfortable doing, if they have the training to do that, and how to best proceed and move forward. So what events are we covering here? I like to say basically anything that is probable / likely could happen. And what I mean by that is, If it's happened at a sister location of your company, if it's happened at a location that does a similar operation as you in your city, state, region, then based on geographically speaking where you're located, is this something that could potentially happen? So just kind of looking at all the different types of emergencies through that lens of, if you're like, yeah, I could see that happening here, then that's probably something that we want to include some parameters for. Here's the general concept of how we would manage this particular emergency. And again, I get you can't, write down and document everything. And I will tell you, as someone who has ran lots of different varieties of different types of events, fires, explosions, things like that, chemical events, you are not sitting and reading a program. But if you don't know what to do, you will also find that there are portions of the event where it's not just a total chaos. It's chaos for the first 15 minutes, generally speaking, but we start managing in 15-minute increments, and there will be a period of time where if you're not sure, you can reference some documentation in there. You will have the time or ability to do that, or that's something that you can delegate to someone else. Say, I need this answer, pretty please, and, politely encouraging them to support and help you, right? So we want to make sure that whatever we're writing as our response to these, it's detailed enough to be helpful, but it's not so wordy and detailed that it's like, I can't even get through this. This is so specific and so detailed, and it actually has nothing to do with what we're talking about. So we're going to do the best we can, try and predict what the likely scenarios are, regarding these specific emergencies, and just do the best we can. In terms of writing those. So fire is one we typically see. Explosion is one we typically see. If you've got a SPCC plan, spill control countermeasures plan, you may reference that program here, or you may have some information in regards to, if we have a spill of something, how are we going to manage that? Whether it be rendering, whether it be used oil, new oil, some type of, non-hazardous chemical, we still have to clean it up and make sure it doesn't have environmental impacts. How are we going to do that? Chemical spills, leaks, hazardous gases, hazardous particulates. We'll probably have some things in there about that. Now, I may not have my entire plan in there. That may be in a hazardous chemical response plan, Hazmat plan, ERP, emergency response plan, depending on whether you have PSM for that chemical or not. If you don't have the threshold to actually have a PSM program or a PSM light around your hazardous chemicals, you may just have how you're going to respond to that within your EAP itself. Medical emergencies, we're going to want to make sure that we have that. If you don't have a nursing staff or an RN staff or a medical staff or any kind of support on site that is managing programs of that nature, first aid CPR programs, medical surveillance programs, follow-up programs, how we're going to manage a medical emergency, crush, amputation, seizure, heart attack, things like that. If you don't have that, I would expect to see probably something along those lines of how we're going to manage those medical emergencies within my EAP. Bomb threat type situations, activist type situations. And what I mean by that is, if we find that we are in an industry where we know sister locations, our specific company, or it's just kind of randomly happening in our region, in our city, and whatever the case may be, if we feel like we have the potential to have folks come into our facility with the intent to disrupt business, cause product loss, and potentially harm the product, animals, livestock, or any of the managers at the facility. So we've had situations where people have, come in and rammed fences and gates, security shacks, and things like that. We've had situations where folks have scaled fences and set fire to livestock barns and set fire to front offices where managers were actually physically at while this is going on. Protests surrounding the facilities, that can be a little bit hazardous for anyone who's having to walk through that protest situation to get to their vehicles. So those are all things that you'll want to kind of consider. Domestic workplace violence, things like that. Are we going to manage that, or do we just call the police? What is going to be our safety and security measures around the workplace violence type situation, and just getting a good plan together for that. PIT in any vehicle or trailer emergency. So, crush, run over, car accidents in the parking lot, things like that. How are we going to manage that? And then anything that's naturally occurring. So that could be hurricanes, could be floods, could be tornadoes, could be earthquakes, whatever's going on in your region. If that's likely to happen, you'll want to make sure that you include those. Obviously, my Midwest states won't have things for hurricane, but they could have things for flood based on if they're near a river and they're in a low-lying area. So we'll just kind of work through that. And then my other big thing here is my return to normal. So there will be a point where all the emergency responders and LAPC and fire and police support, based on how significant and large your emergency was, there will be a portion of time where those folks all leave and you are, as a management team, still at the facility and you're like, okay, but how do we even know where to begin to start getting and piecing things back together to run production again? And again, based on whatever the emergency was, this could be something that happens after 15 minutes. You could be back to your return to normal and just, it could be relatively simple and short. This could be something that takes a few days. This could be something that takes months, depending on the gravity of your emergency and how extensive it was. So again, you'll want to make sure that you've got things in place for, we had a tornado, I've got injured animals, the part of the roof is down. Typically speaking, this is not a fire department or a police thing, that they will not go in and deal with that. So just to make sure that we're avoiding the situation where we are on our hands and knees crawling through an area that is structurally not sound, and to make sure that we are not, face to face with injured animals that could be scared, you want to make sure that we kind of think some of those things through, for instance. So that's one. If I've got any kind of flooding situation going on, hurricane situation going on, I want to think through, after everyone's left and my product, or, if it's a food facility, I may have some significant biological hazards. If I wasn't able to get all of my rendering out, my offal out, my DAF stuff out, my wastewater stuff out, if I couldn't get, I may have, if it was a big enough flood, I may have other things in there from surrounding areas. If this is a situation, like I say, where we've got no power, no cooling, and there's food there that is starting to decay, I could have some pests in addition with those biological hazards of the decay. So those are all things that we want to figure out. Are we going to hire someone for this? Who's that person going to be? Who does this? I mean, what company can we even call around here that would even be willing to do this? Can they come in? Can we write them into our plan so we at least know even where to begin to start working on getting things back together? Fire, explosion, things like that. How do we determine who can go back into the building after these things happen? How do we even know if it's structurally sound to go back in? And who's making that determination? Is that a PE? Who are we calling to try and figure out what needs to be taped off? This portion is not safe to walk in. This other portion is safe. How do we make those determinations to start working through that and figuring that out? And what testing might be required, whether it be from an industrial hygiene or, just a strength of material testing. What does that even look like? So again, I know it can feel a little bit overwhelming. That's why I say this is when you want to bite off in small chunks, when you're in the right frame of mind and you don't have a lot of distractions, because it can be a lot, but it is absolutely, without a doubt, one of the most critical programs that you're going to have at your facility. I don't typically do homework for these podcasts, but I would really highly encourage you to just scan your EAP, become, kind of familiar with what's in it. And if you have questions on how you would physically do that response, or there's significant portions of the details left out, that's something you're either going to want to make sure you're covering in depth in your training and doing lots of drills on, or you've at least got the details written out and you may want to supplement what's there with some additional details. So we're really hoping that you guys found this helpful today. Thanks for joining us. As always, like us on our social media, things like that. You can follow us on social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, all those good things. If you like the podcast, you found it helpful today, and you want to help and do more, please share our podcast with anybody you think it might be helpful or beneficial to. That kind of helps make sure that we can continue to put out this content, because it is free. And so that's super helpful for us. And we're super grateful that you joined us today, and we can't wait to see you next time. Thanks for joining us, and have a great week, everyone. Thank you for listening to Safe, Efficient, Profitable, a worker safety podcast. If you like what you heard here, please take a moment to write us a quick review, like, subscribe, and share our podcast so that others can find us. For questions or to request topics that you'd like to hear on our next show, please visit us at www.allen-safety.com. Thank you.